Okay, and our last act before the short break is a spoken word piece, and that is from Martin Reed. Martin, welcome up.
I sometimes do stories which are based on the fables of Aesop. They're animal fables, they're very short, mercifully short, and they tend to have a moral or a message to go with the story. So I'll start with one which does have a moral actually. Okay, this is the cockroach and the spider. A cockroach, bustling around collecting food, seeing a spider on its web, railed at it. You sit there, just waiting for things to come to you. What if they don't? Then, I suppose, you'll just sit there until you starve to death. You should have some initiative. Go out and get what you want, instead of just hanging around like that. The spider made no reply, merely busying herself with her web. The very next day, the house they were both residents of was fumigated. Both spider and cockroach perished. The moral: don't be a cockroach. This one, I guess, probably doesn't have a moral. There's quite a discussion about. I'm quite interested in what constitutes a story and what constitutes a poem. And basically, this Glenn Maxwell, who's up at the university, one of the lecturers at the university, says there's no such thing as prose poetry. I tend to disagree with him, but he's a very famous poet who's got a Wikipedia entry and all sorts of books, so who am I? But I tend to think that a poem is something which you can't paraphrase. If you can get the text, you cannot paraphrase it into another form, then that's a poem. Otherwise, it's verse or it's prose or whatever. But that's my opinion. And this one would be difficult to paraphrase and get the same meaning, if indeed it has a meaning. Anyway, so this is called The Cat and the Clock. One midnight, the clock abruptly woke up the cat, and this started an argument. The cat railed loudly, remonstrating with the clock. The clock replied. He said, "Shush, you're only a guest in this house. The human beings no longer need your services. They only keep you here out of sentiment." To which the cat rejoined, stiff-backed and haughty, "My kind were companions of humankind long before your kind were even thought of, and will still be when they no longer think of you." At this, the clock had nothing to say, except to tick sullenly all night and on into the next day. Of course, the thing about doing animal stories, let's find the next one, is that they are somewhat similar to children's stories, really. And this one is sort of in the grey area between adult story and children's story. I'm not sure which it is, but it's a bit longer than the last one. This one lasts 3 minutes, actually. But anyway. Once there was a horse who was really, really lucky. His mother had been a mare who had been very famous in her time, winning everything from Ascot to the Grand National, a very important race, of course. His sire was from a long line of winners. The stables where he was trained and brought up were owned by a very rich man, and so his trainer was the best in the business. Now, thinking how lucky his horse actually was, his owner had called him Lucky, so that was his name as well. In training, Lucky proved to be the fastest horse the stables had ever had, the most agile, the best in the final sprint. And so, when the time came for this horse's first race, his trainer, who thought of Lucky as his lucky horse, bet a great deal of money on him, relying on the fact that very few people knew just how good the horse was. Intensive preparations were made for the race, and finally, the day came. They were at the racetrack. They were at the start line. They were under starter's orders. Lucky, 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 be lucky, shouted the trainer. Lucky shot away first, then held himself back. Held himself back to conserve his energy, waiting for the final stretch. He followed the leaders all the way round until it was time to increase his pace. He was in sight of the finish. His jockey hardly had to spur him on. Lucky eased in front of the others. Then a little girl by the side of the track, who just loved the look of his shiny, dark, glossy coat, held out some sweets to him, and they just happened to be Lucky's favourites. Extra strong mints. Lucky stopped, just stopped, stopped still, and so his rider, of course, fell off. Lucky wandered across to eat the sweets. They were his favourites after all. How lucky there were some here, he thought. The rest of the horses zipped past him and some other complete unknown won the race. Lucky's trainer, having lost thousands and thousands of pounds, was enraged at his so-called lucky horse. He had had horses turned into dog food for much less. Much, much less. He wasn't in training for the love of horses. No, he was in it for the money. He approached a paddock where the horses were resting, with his hair on end, his eyes bulging, his rough, fat face bright purple. So angry was he that he was hardly looking where he was going, slipped on some horse poo, twisted his ankle, and had to be rushed into hospital. By the time he recovered, Lucky had been sold on by the owner to someone who had been impressed by his earlier performance in the race. By God, that horse was lucky. This one, I always like to end on this one because it's so positive and upbeat. This is called The Worms. Worms live on what remains. In the last days, there will be the worms consuming the remains and the remains of themselves. Under the tired light of a dying star, the worms will hold sway. Then, a reaching, open mouth of worms will be all there is of poetry and dance. A slithering of worm on worm, all there will be of song. In these last days, there will be time for principalities, powers, dominions, and thrones of worms. A worm paradise. And the moral is, there is always hope.